In 1650 BCE, somewhere along the Jordan Valley near the Dead Sea, a city of over 8,000 people vanished in a single moment. Not over weeks, not over days, in less than 1 second. The blast that hit this place reached temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. Pottery melted on one side and stayed completely untouched on the other. A 4-story palace was sheared clean off its foundation, as if a giant hand had swept it away like dust. The people inside never had a chance to run. Their bones were found shattered into fragments so small that archaeologists could barely identify them as human. And when the smoke cleared, the land itself turned toxic. Salt saturated the soil so completely that nothing would grow there again for 600 years. An entire region, once described as looking like the Garden of Eden, was turned into a wasteland. For thousands of years, the only record of this event existed in the pages of the Bible. Genesis tells us that God rained fire and brimstone from the heavens and destroyed a city so wicked that not even 10 righteous people could be found within its walls. Most people assumed it was a parable, a moral lesson wrapped in metaphor. But then, archaeologists started digging in the Jordanian desert, and what they found beneath the sand changed everything. Because this was not some forgettable village on the edge of nowhere. This was the largest continuously occupied Bronze Age city in the entire southern Levant. It was called el-Hammam, and at its peak, it was 10 times the size of Jerusalem and 5 times larger than ancient Jericho. It covered roughly 36 hectares of dense, thriving urban life. Its people built walls 50 feet high and 17 feet thick, fortified with towers, multiple gates, and defensive ramparts made entirely of mud brick. This was a civilization that dominated everything around it for over 1,000 years. From the western edge of its acropolis, the kings who ruled from el-Hammam had a direct line of sight across nearly 200 square kilometers of territory. They controlled the trade routes, the water, and the food supply. And they did all of this from a palace complex that rose 4 to 5 stories into the sky, built on the highest point of the upper city like a crown sitting on top of the world. It had hot and cold running water, fed by 2 natural springs located inside the city walls. One spring was warm, the other was cold. The very name of the site translates to the Mound of the Hot Baths. Think about that. Nearly 4,000 years ago, while most civilizations were hauling water from rivers in clay jars, the people of this city had natural spring water flowing through their settlement. The surrounding landscape was lush and green, fed by perennial streams from the north and south. Farmers worked the land in every direction, and dozens of smaller towns and villages radiated outward from the main city for miles. This was the beating heart of a kingdom. And according to Genesis, this is exactly what Lot saw when he looked out across the plain. The Bible describes the land as well-watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord. That description was not poetry, it was geography. And the geography fits el-Hammam with almost unsettling precision. And then there is the gate. In Genesis chapter 19, the Bible describes Lot sitting in the gate of Sodom when 2 angels arrived to warn him. This detail might seem minor, but to archaeologists, it is enormous. City gates in the ancient world were not just entry points, they were seats of power, places where legal disputes were settled, where merchants negotiated, where the most important people gathered. Finding the gate complex of an ancient city is one of the most significant discoveries a team can make. And at el-Hammam, they found exactly that. A large, pillared gatehouse, constructed in a style resembling Minoan palatial architecture, complete with stone bench seating inside the structure. When the site architect first laid eyes on it, his reaction was immediate. If this place is Sodom, he said, then this is exactly where Lot would have been sitting. The gatehouse was built into the massive defensive fortifications, positioned as the main and only formal entrance into the city, and it stood right where the Bible said it should be. But all of that power, all of that wealth, all of that engineering meant nothing on the day the sky caught fire. Around 1650 BCE, something arrived from above. Not an army, not a plague. Something from the sky itself. The leading theory among researchers is that a meteor, roughly 50 meters wide, entered the atmosphere at over 60,000 kilometers per hour and detonated approximately 4 kilometers above the city. It never hit the ground. There was no crater. But the explosion it produced was beyond anything the ancient world could have comprehended. Researchers estimate the blast carried the energy of roughly 1,000 Hiroshima-sized atomic detonations. The resulting shockwave, traveling at supersonic speeds, slammed into the city from the southwest, tearing through every structure in its path. The 4-meter-thick mud brick ramparts that had protected the city for centuries were obliterated. The top 12 meters of the palace complex were simply gone, sheared away as if they had never existed. Buildings that had stood for generations were flattened and driven into the ground. And the heat that accompanied this shockwave was something out of a nightmare. When archaeologists began excavating the destruction layer at Tol el-Hammam, what they found was unlike anything typically seen at ancient sites destroyed by war or earthquake. The entire city was capped by a layer of carbon and ash, roughly 1.5 meters thick. Within that layer, they discovered pottery sherds with outer surfaces that had been melted into glass. Some of them bubbled as if the clay had been boiling. Mud brick fragments showed the same kind of melting. Roofing clay had fused into glassy material. Laboratory analysis revealed that temperatures during the event had briefly exceeded 2,000 degrees Celsius. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the temperature of volcanic magma. It is hotter than the melting point of gold, silver, and platinum. And the evidence showed that these extreme temperatures lasted for only a fraction of a second. The pottery that melted on one side remained completely intact on the other. That kind of one-sided thermal signature does not come from a slow-burning city fire. It does not come from a volcanic eruption. It comes from a single, instantaneous blast of heat, so intense that it turned solid materials into liquid before the warmth could even travel through to the other side. But the melted pottery was only the beginning. Deeper in the destruction layer, researchers found something that stunned the scientific community. They found shocked quartz. Quartz is one of the hardest minerals on Earth. Under normal conditions, it does not crack in any unusual way. But when exposed to pressures between 5 and 10 gigapascals, the kind of pressure you only see in nuclear detonations or asteroid impacts, it develops a specific pattern of internal fractures called planar deformation features. These fractures are considered one of the most reliable indicators of a cosmic impact event, and they were found all over Tel el-Hammam. Alongside the shocked quartz, researchers identified diamond-like carbon particles, atoms compressed under such extreme force that they rearrange into a structure resembling diamond. The only known natural processes that produce this at the surface of the Earth are cosmic impacts and nuclear explosions. There were also tiny iron and silica-rich spherules, microscopic balls of metal that form when metallic material is briefly melted and then rapidly cooled in midair. Each finding on its own would be remarkable. Together, they painted a picture of an event so violent that modern science had only one real comparison. That comparison was the Tunguska event of 1908. On the morning of June 30th that year, a massive explosion occurred over the Siberian taiga. There was no crater, no meteorite was ever recovered. But the blast flattened roughly 80 million trees across over 2,000 square kilometers. Windows shattered hundreds of miles away. Scientists estimated the object was a meteor, roughly 50 to 60 meters wide, that detonated in the atmosphere, releasing energy equivalent to 12 megatons of TNT. The parallels between Tunguska and Tall el-Hammam are striking. Both produced extreme temperatures without leaving a crater. Both generated massive shockwaves that leveled everything in their path. Both left behind signatures of a cosmic airburst. But there was one critical difference. Tunguska happened over uninhabited forest. Tall el-Hammam was a densely populated city. When researchers overlaid the estimated Tunguska blast radius onto a map of the Dead Sea region, the area of total destruction lined up almost perfectly with the archaeological evidence across the Jordan Valley. And then there were the people. The human remains found within the destruction layer at Tall el-Hammam told a story that was almost too terrible to process. The bones were not simply burned. They were found in a state of extreme disarticulation and fragmentation, meaning that human bodies had been torn apart and shattered by the force of the blast. Skeletal fragments were scattered across the debris field, mixed in with pulverized mud brick, melted pottery, and charred grain. The pattern of distribution was consistent with a supersonic shockwave hitting the city at speeds exceeding 700 miles per hour. At those speeds, the air itself becomes a weapon. The pressure wave would have been strong enough to rip apart structures and bodies simultaneously. People inside their homes had no warning. One moment they were alive, the next, they simply were not. The speed of the event was measured in fractions of a second. But perhaps the most haunting piece of evidence was not the fire, or the shattered bones, or the melted pottery. It was the salt. Within the destruction layer, researchers found abnormally high concentrations of salt, averaging around 4% in the sediment, with some samples reaching as high as 25%. The likely explanation is that the airburst partially impacted the Dead Sea, which is one of the saltiest bodies of water on Earth. The shockwave and resulting heat would have vaporized enormous quantities of Dead Sea brine, launching salt crystals high into the atmosphere, where they then rained back down across the entire region. The effect on the land was catastrophic. Soil saturated with that much salt cannot support plant life. Crops will not germinate. Trees will not take root. And this is exactly what the archaeological record shows. After the destruction event, roughly 120 settlements within a 25-kilometer radius of Tall el-Hammam were completely abandoned. Not partially, not gradually. Completely. The population dropped from tens of thousands to perhaps a few hundred nomads, and nobody came back for 300 to 600 years. An entire civilization erased from the map. Now, consider the biblical account one more time. In Genesis, when Lot and his family are told to flee the city, they receive one very specific instruction: do not look back. Lot's wife disobeys. She turns around, and according to the text, she becomes a pillar of salt. For centuries, scholars treated this as pure allegory, a moral lesson about disobedience. But think about what we now know happened at Tall el-Hammam. A massive, salt-laden blast swept across the landscape. Anyone caught in the open, facing the explosion, would have been coated in a superheated wave of salt-saturated debris. The idea of a person being encased in salt is no longer a metaphor. It is a plausible physical description of what happens when a human body is caught in the path of a salt-loaded airburst. The ancient writers did not have words for meteor or cosmic airburst or supersonic shockwave, but they had eyes. And what they described, fire and brimstone raining from heaven, the smoke of the land going up like the smoke of a furnace, and a woman turned to salt, reads less like a parable and more like the testimony of someone who watched it happen from a safe distance.
Of course, not everyone agrees that Tal el-Hammam is Sodom, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. For nearly a century, most Bible maps placed Sodom and the other cities of the plain in the southeastern corner of the Dead Sea, near two sites called Bab ed-Dara and Numera. Those sites were also destroyed by fire during the early Bronze Age, and for decades they were considered the leading candidates. The argument for the southern location rests partly on a passage from Ezekiel that uses directional language, suggesting Sodom lay to the south of Jerusalem. Some scholars argue that the text of Genesis describes Lot traveling southward, not northward, which would rule out Tal el-Hammam entirely. Others point out that the dating of the destruction, around 1650 BCE, does not perfectly align with every proposed chronology for the age of Abraham. These are real objections raised by serious researchers, and they deserve to be taken seriously. The identification of Tal el-Hammam as Sodom remains a hypothesis, not a settled conclusion. But the case in favor of Tal el-Hammam is formidable. The lead excavator, Dr. Stephen Collins, spent years studying the geographical markers embedded in the text of Genesis before ever setting foot in Jordan. The Bible says that Lot looked eastward from Bethel and Ai, two ancient towns located about 15 kilometers north of Jerusalem, and saw a well-watered plain that looked like the garden of the Lord. That description points northeast toward the lower Jordan Valley, not south toward the arid landscape near the southern Dead Sea. The Bible also consistently mentions Sodom first when listing the cities of the plain, which in ancient writing convention meant it was the largest and most prominent. Tal el-Hammam is the largest site in the region by a massive margin. Its size, its location relative to Bethel, its position in a well-watered valley, its monumental architecture, its city gate, and its catastrophic destruction by fire all line up with the Genesis account in ways that no other candidate site can match. Is it proof? No. But the convergence of evidence is difficult to ignore. There is another layer to this story that deserves attention. In 2021, a team of researchers published a major study in the journal Scientific Reports arguing that Tal el-Hammam had been destroyed by a Tunguska-sized cosmic airburst. The paper attracted enormous attention and was covered by outlets around the world, but it also generated controversy. Some scientists criticized the methodology. A physicist cited in the paper publicly distanced himself from its conclusions. And in April 2025, Scientific Reports formally retracted the paper, citing errors in methodology and data interpretation. That retraction is important and should not be brushed aside. Science works by constantly questioning its own findings. However, the research team responded by publishing an expanded version through a separate peer-reviewed platform, incorporating additional evidence. The debate is ongoing, and the physical evidence at the site, the melted materials, the shocked minerals, the salt deposits, remains real and measurable, regardless of which paper you choose to cite. What is not debated by anyone is what happened to the region after the destruction. Whatever caused it, the Jordan Valley experienced a catastrophic collapse. Archaeologists refer to it as the Late Bronze Age Gap. For roughly 600 years, the eastern side of the Jordan Disk was essentially uninhabited. Cities that had thrived for millennia were abandoned. The soil was poisoned. The water could no longer support crops. Neighboring Jericho, about 22 kilometers west, appears to have been destroyed around the same time. Radiocarbon dating of the destruction layers at both sites produced statistically identical results, suggesting a single event took them both. While Jericho recovered within a few hundred years, the sites on the eastern side of the plain did not. No late Bronze Age pottery has ever been found at Tal el-Hammam. Meaningful resettlement did not begin until around 1000 BCE.
The gap is enormous. And in the ancient world, where cities were routinely rebuilt after earthquakes and wars, a 600-year abandonment is almost unheard of. Something about this destruction was different. Something about this land was fundamentally broken.
And this is where the story becomes something more than archaeology. Because if the destruction of Tal el-Hammam truly happened the way the evidence suggests, then it was almost certainly witnessed. The blast would have been visible from miles away. The fireball, the shockwave, the mushroom cloud of salt and debris rising into the sky. People in the surrounding hills would have seen the sky light up and the earth shake, and they would have talked about it. They would have told their children, who would have told their grandchildren, passing the story down through generation after generation of oral tradition. Details would have shifted, names would have changed. The cause of the destruction, incomprehensible to people with no concept of meteors, would have been attributed to the only force powerful enough to explain it: the wrath of God, fire and brimstone from the heavens, the complete annihilation of a people so wicked that the Creator intervened to wipe them from the earth. That is how oral tradition works. The core event is real. The explanation is shaped by the understanding of the people who witnessed it. And over 1,000 years later, when those stories were finally written down in Genesis, the destruction of Sodom became one of the most famous cautionary tales in human history. What makes this discovery so compelling is not just the question of whether Tal el-Hammam is Sodom. It is what the site tells us about the fragility of human civilization. Here was a city that had thrived for over 1,000 years, a city with walls and gates and palaces and running water, a city that dominated its entire region with power that no neighbor could challenge. And in less than 1 second, it was gone. Not weakened, not damaged, gone. The walls that had taken generations to build were reduced to rubble. The people who had spent their lives within those walls were reduced to fragments of bone. The land that had fed them was poisoned beyond recovery. Everything they had built, everything they had achieved, everything they believed made them safe, meant nothing in the face of a force that arrived without warning from a clear sky. There is a reason this story has resonated for thousands of years. It is not just about religion. It is about the fundamental truth that no civilization, no matter how powerful, is immune to sudden, total destruction.
And the threat has not gone away. Scientists estimate that Tunguska-class airbursts occur somewhere on Earth roughly once every few hundred years. Most happen over oceans or uninhabited areas. But the Chelyabinsk event of 2013, when a meteor roughly 20 meters wide exploded over a Russian city, injured more than 1,500 people and damaged thousands of buildings. That object was less than half the estimated size of whatever destroyed Tal el-Hammam. If it had been larger, lower, or aimed at a major population center, the consequences would have been catastrophic. Tal el-Hammam is a reminder that the line between civilization and oblivion is thinner than we like to believe. It is also a reminder that the ancients were not as naive as we sometimes assume. When the writers of Genesis described fire falling from the sky and an entire region turning into a salt-covered wasteland, they were not inventing fiction. They were recording, in the only language available to them, the memory of something real, something terrifying, something that wiped a civilization off the map and left a scar on the landscape that lasted for centuries.
There is still so much we do not know.
The identification of Tal el-Hammam as Sodom remains fiercely debated, and new excavation seasons continue to produce both evidence and controversy. The airburst hypothesis is far from settled. The dating of the destruction does not fit neatly into every proposed biblical chronology. And the broader question of how oral traditions transform real events into religious narratives is one that scholars have grappled with for centuries. But what is undeniable is that something extraordinary happened at Tal el-Hammam around 3,600 years ago. A thriving city was destroyed in an instant by forces that produced temperatures and pressures consistent with a cosmic event. The land was rendered uninhabitable for centuries, and the story of that destruction was remembered, passed down, and eventually written into one of the most widely read books in human history. Whether you approach this as a person of faith, as a skeptic, or as someone who loves a good mystery, the story of Tal el-Hammam demands your attention. Thousands of years ago, a city stood on the edge of the Dead Sea, with walls that seemed unbreakable and wealth that seemed endless. Its people looked out over green fields and flowing water and believed they were untouchable. And then, in a flash brighter than anything they had ever seen, it was over. The fire came from above. The earth shook. The air itself became a weapon. And when the dust settled, there was nothing left but ash, salt, and silence. For centuries after, travelers passing through the Jordan Valley would have seen nothing but barren, salt-crusted ground where a great city once stood. They would have asked what happened here. And the answer, passed down across dozens of generations, was simple. God destroyed this place. Today, nearly 4,000 years later, archaeologists are pulling melted pottery and shattered quartz from the ground at that very site. The answer they are finding is not simple at all, but it is extraordinary. And it suggests that one of the oldest stories ever told may have been rooted in one of the most violent natural events in human history. The city that God destroyed may have finally been found, and the truth buried beneath it is more astonishing than any of us ever imagined.